1945, an Egyptian farmer's shovel struck something that would shake Christianity to its core. Not gold, not pottery, but 52 forbidden gospels that the Church had tried to erase from history for 1,600 years. What if everything you've been told about Jesus Christ is incomplete? What if the Church has been hiding the most important truth for 2 millennia? What if there's a bloodline walking among us today that could rewrite human history? What if the Holy Grail was never a cup at all? The morning mist clings to the French Pyrenees like secrets to stone. In hidden chambers beneath ancient churches, whispers echo of a truth so dangerous that men have died to protect it and others have killed to suppress it. The musty scent of parchment, older than nations, carries stories that could topple governments and shatter faith. Over 200 locations across Europe claim to house the Holy Grail. Mathematical impossibility or deliberate misdirection. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest something far more extraordinary than a simple chalice. The term sang real royal blood was deliberately mistranslated as San Grail, Holy Grail. Was this an accident or the greatest deception in human history? DNA evidence sits locked in church vaults, deliberately suppressed by those who fear its revelations. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and what we've discovered will challenge everything you believe about the foundations of Western civilization. High in the hills of Judea, 2,000 years ago, limestone chalices sat on wooden tables in homes where ritual purity was paramount. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that the Last Supper cup was not the golden goblet of medieval imagination, but a simple stone vessel carved from soft, chalky limestone, according to Second Temple period customs. Dr. Abigail Saunders runs her fingers over pottery fragments discovered near Jerusalem. During the Second Temple period, when Jesus and his disciples partook in the Last Supper, Jewish people in Judea had an obsession with ritual purity. Most dishes at this time were ceramic, but according to Leviticus, ceramic dishes could become permanently unclean and unusable. The October 2024 discovery beneath Petra's treasury sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. A ceramic vessel bearing an uncanny resemblance to the Holy Grail of legend was found clutched in the skeletal remains of a 2,000-year-old burial. Though later identified as a 1st century BC jug fragment, the symbolism was unmistakable. When we spotted what looked like a chalice, all of us just froze, recalls expedition leader Josh Gates. It looked nearly identical to the Holy Grail featured in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade set in the ancient building directly above the tomb. It was the ultimate moment of life imitating art. But this was only the beginning. New scientific techniques have revolutionized archaeological dating. The Holy Grail of archaeology itself, a groundbreaking method analyzing fatty acids absorbed into pottery surfaces, now allows scientists to date ancient vessels within the span of a single human lifetime. Joseph of Arimathea possessed the wealth to own such precious vessels. The Gospels describe him as a secret follower of Jesus, a member of the Sanhedrin, with enough influence to claim Christ's body after the crucifixion. If anyone had access to the cup used at the Last Supper, it would have been this mysterious benefactor. Yet standing beside Joseph in the Gospel accounts is another figure the Church has systematically obscured. Mary Magdalene described not as a repentant sinner, but as Jesus' financial sponsor and closest companion. But what we discovered in those ancient texts would force us to question not just what the Grail was, but who was meant to carry its legacy. In a basement laboratory in France, Dr. Philippe Charlier carefully examines a skull that has rested in the Basilica of Saint-Maximin for over 7 centuries. Using cutting-edge facial reconstruction technology, he and artist Philippe Frouche have revealed the face that gazes back from their computer screen, a woman with a pointed nose, high cheekbones, and a round face. We are absolutely not sure that this is the true skull of Mary Magdalene, Charlier admits. but it was very important to get it out of anonymity. For those who believe these are the bones of Mary Magdalene, this is the face of one of Christianity's most controversial figures. The woman the Catholic Church branded a prostitute for 15 centuries. The woman modern scholarship reveals as something far more significant. It was very emotional work for us. Frosch confesses his voice heavy with the weight of reconstructing someone who might have walked with Christ. Mary Magdalene appears in the canonical Gospels not as a fallen woman, but as a financial supporter of Jesus' ministry. She is present at the crucifixion when the male disciples have fled. She is the first witness to the resurrection. Yet for centuries, the Church has portrayed her as a repentant sinner, rather than acknowledging her true role. Harvard Divinity School professor Karen King spent years studying the evidence. The only conclusive evidence of Magdalene's role points to her as a follower of Jesus. She may have played a crucial role in developing the early foundations of Christianity, but the transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostle to prostitute was no accident. Medieval documents reveal that as early as the 13th century, Cathar Christians taught in secret meetings that Mary Magdalene was the wife of Christ. The Church's systematic campaign to discredit her becomes clear when we understand what they were trying to suppress. The Gospel of Philip, discovered in the Nag Hammadi collection, describes Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, whom he kissed often on the mouth. While scholars debate the translation, the intimacy is undeniable. Dr. Kimberly Fowler, who specializes in the Nag Hammadi texts, explains the significance. While most people tend to consider these as stemming from some sort of Gnostic Christian thought, what is perhaps more interesting is the fact that they were clearly copied out, produced and used by Christian monks in the area. These weren't fringe beliefs held by heretics in desert caves. These were texts copied and preserved by the very monasteries that formed the backbone of early Christianity. Rumors that Mary Magdalene's remains were in southern France gained popularity in 1279. And since then, her remains have been found in at least 5 different regions. Each discovery carefully documented each claim, supported by local traditions, stretching back centuries. The pattern becomes clear when we trace the legends. Medieval accounts consistently place Mary Magdalene not in Palestine after the crucifixion, but in France accompanied by children. But the real question isn't whether Jesus and Mary were married, it's whether their children survived and where they are today. Muhammad al-Saman was 17 years old when his shovel struck the earthenware jar that would change biblical scholarship forever. Digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, he uncovered 13 leather-bound papyrus codices containing 52 texts that didn't make it into the biblical canon. The cache included the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Secret Revelation of John, documents that painted a radically different picture of early Christianity than the version that survived in the New Testament. Inside a meter-tall clay jar were 52 texts that didn't make it into the canon, explains biblical scholar James Robinson. As 20th century scholars began translating the texts from Coptic early Christians, whose views had fallen out of favor or were silenced, began speaking again across the ages in their own voices. The timing of the burial is significant. These codices were likely hidden after St. Athanasius condemned the use of non-canonical books in his festal letter of 367 AD. Someone, perhaps monks from a nearby Pachomian monastery, made the dangerous decision to preserve these forbidden texts rather than destroy them. The Gospel of Philip contains 17 sayings attributed to Jesus, 9 of which are interpretations found in the canonical Gospels. But the new sayings present a Jesus who speaks intimately of spiritual marriage of secrets, hidden from the masses of knowledge reserved for the initiated. The Savior loved Mary Magdalene more than all the other disciples and kissed her often on the mouth, reads one passage. The disciples were troubled by this and said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" The Savior answered them, "Why do I not love you like her? The Greek word koinonos, used to describe Mary's relationship with Jesus, can mean companion, partner, or consort. The ambiguity may be deliberate, or it may reflect a truth too dangerous to state explicitly. Dr. Elaine Pagels, whose research brought the Gnostic Gospels to popular attention, discovered that these texts weren't just theological curiosities. What is perhaps more interesting about them is the fact that they were clearly copied out, produced and used by Christian monks in the area. So this is how I tend to try and approach them. These weren't heretical texts created by outsiders seeking to undermine Christianity. These were Christian documents produced by Christian communities presenting Christian teachings that happened to contradict the version of faith that ultimately triumphed in Rome. The Sahidic dialect of Coptic and the style of handwriting help scholars date the fragments to the second half of the 4th century AD. The presence of writing on both sides confirms these were part of bound books, codices rather than scrolls, suggesting widespread circulation and study. One scholar notes that the scribe's handwriting was proficient but not refined, suggesting these Gospels were read not in formal church settings where elegant calligraphy prevailed, but among early Christians who gathered in homes for private study. The implications are staggering. If these texts represent authentic early Christian beliefs, then the version of Christianity that became orthodox was not the original, but the winner in a theological civil war that raged for centuries. These weren't just alternative Gospels, they were blueprints for a completely different Christianity, one where Mary Magdalene held the keys to the kingdom. Dr. Carlos de Ayala adjusts his glasses as he reviews the manuscript before him. As a medieval historian at a Madrid university, he has spent decades studying the origins of the Grail legend. His conclusion is unequivocal. The Grail legend is a literary invention of the 12th century, with no historical basis. You cannot search for something that does not exist. The academic consensus is clear. The Holy Grail first appears in literature around 1190 in Chrétien de Troyes' unfinished romance, Percival, the Story of the Grail. In this earliest version, the Grail is not explicitly holy, not necessarily Christian, and certainly not connected to Jesus Christ. Robert de Boron, writing shortly after Chrétien transformed the literary device into a Christian relic. In his Joseph d'Arimathie, the Grail becomes the vessel used by Joseph of Arimathea to catch Christ's blood at the crucifixion. But this is poetry, not history. Wolfram von Eschenbach reimagined the Grail as a stone rather than a cup. Each subsequent author adapted the legend to serve their own purposes, creating a mythology that bears little resemblance to historical fact. The Jesus Seminar. A group of scholars involved in the quest for the historical Jesus conducted extensive research into the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Their conclusion was definitive. They were unable to determine whether Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a matrimonial relationship due to the dearth of historical evidence. Professor Sarah Rowlands of Rhodes College summarizes the scholarly position. The historical Mary Magdalene was not a repentant prostitute, but a prominent disciple of Jesus and authority in the early Christian community. But there is no credible evidence she was his wife. More than 200 goblets across Europe alone have been claimed as the Holy Grail. The Antioch chalice discovered in 1910 was hailed as the authentic cup for decades before being dated to the 6th century. The Holy Chalice of Valencia, housed in the cathedral since 1436, has equally dubious provenance. The pattern is always the same, a medieval artifact with uncertain origins, local legends that cannot be verified, and claims that crumble under scholarly scrutiny. Dr. Richard Barber, author of The Holy Grail, Imagination and Belief, explains the phenomenon. The Grail operates in the realm of imagination rather than history. It is a symbol that has proven endlessly adaptable to different times and needs. Even the etymology that conspiracy theorists cite, the transformation of sang real royal blood into San Grail Holy Grail, appears only in 15th century sources long after the Grail legend was established. The academic method demands evidence, primary sources, archaeological confirmation, independent verification. None of these exist for the claims surrounding Jesus and Mary Magdalene's supposed offspring. Professor Amy Jill Levine of Vanderbilt University puts it bluntly: there is no evidence that Jesus was married. The Gospels, our earliest sources, give no indication of a wife. Later legends are just that, legends. But what if the scholars are protecting something more than just historical accuracy? What if they're protecting themselves? Cardinal Giuseppe Versaldi moves through the Vatican's secret archives with the measured pace of someone who understands the weight of history. As prefect of the Congregation for Catholic Education, he has spent his career defending orthodox teaching against what he terms sensationalized speculation. The Church's position on Mary Magdalene is based on careful study of the earliest and most reliable sources, he explains. She was indeed a follower of Jesus, but there is no credible evidence for the claims of marriage or children. The Catholic Church's transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostle to penitent prostitute was formalized around the 5th century, when Pope Gregory the Great conflated her with the unnamed sinful woman in Luke's Gospel. This interpretation dominated Christian thought for over 14 centuries, but the Church had reasons beyond theology for this transformation. The Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi reveal early Christian communities where women held positions of authority that later orthodoxy would find unacceptable. The Gospel of Mary portrays Mary Magdalene receiving special revelation from Jesus and teaching the other disciples. Peter responds with anger. Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? This tension between male and female authority in early Christianity created a theological crisis that the developing Church resolved by diminishing Mary Magdalene's role and elevating Peter's. Dr. Jane Shaberg, author of The Resurrection of Mary Magdalene, argues that this was a deliberate suppression. The Church Fathers were uncomfortable with the idea of a woman being the primary witness to the resurrection, so they transformed her into a repentant sinner whose testimony could be safely marginalized. The systematic destruction of alternative Christian texts began in earnest after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. The Theodosian Code of 435 ordered the burning of all Nestorian writings. Similar purges eliminated Arian, Gnostic, and other heretical texts. Peter of Vaux de Cernay, writing between 1212 and 1218, provides the most detailed account of Cathar beliefs about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. According to his Historia Albigensis, the Cathars taught that Mary Magdalene was the concubine of Jesus. The Albigensian crusade that followed was unprecedented in its brutality. When the city of Béziers fell in 1209, papal legate Arnaud Amalric reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." 20,000 people died in a single day. This wasn't just theological disagreement. This was the systematic elimination of an alternative Christianity that threatened the Church's authority. Modern Vatican scholars acknowledge the complexity of early Christian history while maintaining orthodox positions. Dr. Roberto Priscilla of the Pontifical Biblical Commission explains, "We must distinguish between what can be known historically and what belongs to the realm of faith. The Church's teaching is based on careful interpretation of Scripture and tradition, yet access to Church archives remains restricted. Researchers seeking to examine early manuscripts face bureaucratic obstacles that can delay studies for years or prevent them entirely." The Church had good reason to be afraid, because across the centuries, whispers of the bloodline refused to die. Dr. April DeConnick sits in her office at Rice University, surrounded by translations of Coptic texts that have consumed her career. As one of the world's leading experts on Gnostic Christianity, she finds herself caught between competing demands for scholarly rigor and public fascination with alternative histories. The Academy has very strict standards for what constitutes evidence, she explains. We require primary sources, independent verification, and peer review. When these standards aren't met, we have to say so regardless of how compelling the alternative narrative might be. The peer review process, cornerstone of academic credibility, can also function as a gatekeeping mechanism. Scholars who challenge established narratives face career consequences that extend beyond mere intellectual disagreement. Professor Elaine Pagels discovered this when her groundbreaking work on the Gnostic Gospels challenged traditional interpretations of early Christianity. There was significant resistance from some quarters of the academic establishment, not because the evidence wasn't sound, but because the implications were uncomfortable. The mathematical arguments against bloodline survival appear compelling on the surface. Historian Ken Monshine ridiculed the notion infant mortality in pre-modern times was ridiculously high, and you'd only need one childhood accident or disease in 2,000 years to wipe out the bloodline. But this argument assumes a single line of descent, rather than the branching family trees that actually characterize royal genealogies. If Jesus and Mary Magdalene had multiple children, and if even a fraction of their descendants survived to reproduce, the mathematical outcome would be exponential growth rather than extinction. Dr. Mark Goodacre of Duke University represents the conservative scholarly position. The burden of proof lies with those making extraordinary claims. Marriage leaves traces in the historical record, marriage contracts, dowries, inheritance disputes. We have none of these for Jesus. Yet this argument from silence ignores the systematic destruction of early Christian records that didn't conform to Orthodox theology. How can we expect marriage contracts to survive when entire libraries of heretical texts were burned? The tension becomes personal when scholars confront the gap between their academic training and their spiritual beliefs. Dr. Jane Shaberg spent years wrestling with the implications of her research on Mary Magdalene. I was raised Catholic, she admits. When my research led me to conclusions that challenged church teaching, I had to decide whether I was a scholar first or a believer first. That's a choice that affects not just your career, but your entire sense of identity. Translation presents another layer of complexity. The Coptic word koinonos used to describe Mary Magdalene's relationship with Jesus can mean companion, partner, consort, or wife. Scholar choice in translation inevitably reflects their theological assumptions. Carbon dating, while scientifically sound, cannot resolve questions of authenticity versus forgery. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife fragment studied by Harvard's Karen King was carbon dated to the 4th century. But scholars remain divided on whether it represents authentic early Christian belief or medieval fabrication. The emergence of the historical Jesus movement in the 20th century promised to separate historical fact from theological interpretation. But as scholars have discovered, the sources themselves are so thoroughly shaped by theological concerns that purely objective historical reconstruction may be impossible. Dr. Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina summarizes the dilemma: we have to work with the sources we have, not the sources we wish we had. And those sources were written by believers for believers with theological agendas that inevitably shape how they present historical events. But in the shadows of academia, a few brave researchers were uncovering connections the establishment didn't want them to find. The village of Rennes-le-Château clings to its hilltop in the French Pyrenees, like a secret that refuses to be forgotten. Population fewer than 100 souls, annual visitors over 20,000, drawn by mysteries that stretch back over a century. Abbé Bérenger Saunière arrived as parish priest in 1885 to find the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in ruins and his parishioners impoverished. Within a few years, he was spending money on a scale that defied explanation, renovating the church building, a villa, constructing a tower, and importing rare books from across Europe. His unexplained wealth sparked rumors that have only grown more elaborate with time. Local legends speak of buried treasure, the resting place of the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, even the tombs of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, hidden somewhere in the labyrinthine caves beneath the village. Noel Corbu, who purchased Saunière's villa and transformed it into a restaurant, began spreading stories in the 1950s to attract tourists. The first newspapers printed Corbu's claims in 1956. Saunière had discovered ancient treasure hidden in a pillar of his church. The strategy worked. Visitors with shovels flooded the town, and the legend of Rennes-le-Château was born. But the truth proved more complex than Corbu's simple treasure story. Research into church archives revealed that Saunière's wealth came from a more mundane source: trafficking in masses. He advertised across Europe, offering to say masses for the dead in exchange for donations, then collected far more money than he could possibly have earned through legitimate services. Yet this prosaic explanation couldn't kill the mystery. In the 1960s, a document surfaced claiming that Saunière had discovered parchments hidden in the church altar, leading him to a secret that made him wealthy beyond imagination. Henry Lincoln, a British screenwriter, encountered the story while vacationing in France and produced 3 BBC documentaries that transformed local legend into international sensation. Lincoln and his collaborators Michael Bagent and Richard Lee expanded the narrative in their 1982 bestseller, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Their hypothesis was audacious. The parchments revealed that Jesus and Mary Magdalene's descendants had fled to southern France, where they intermarried with Frankish nobility to create the Merovingian dynasty. If our hypothesis is correct, they wrote after fleeing the Holy Land. Jesus' wife and offspring found a refuge in the south of France, and in a Jewish community, they preserved their lineage. During the 5th century, this lineage appears to have intermarried with the royal line of the Franks, thus engendering the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingians ruled the Franks from the 5th to 8th centuries, creating the largest and most powerful kingdom in Western Europe following the collapse of Rome. They were known as the long-haired kings for their custom of never cutting their hair, a symbol of their sacred authority. Medieval chronicles record a curious legend about the dynasty's founder. The Chronicle of Fredegar states that Merovech was conceived when his mother encountered a beast of Neptune, rather like a kinotaur, while bathing in the sea. The child born from this union became the ancestor of the Merovingian kings. This legend of supernatural conception bears striking parallels to the virgin birth narrative surrounding Jesus, were the Merovingians claiming divine ancestry for reasons that went beyond political legitimacy. Genealogical records show that despite official claims of extinction, Merovingian bloodlines survived through strategic marriages into other noble houses. The family maintained dominance over monasteries by appointing family members as abbots, preserving both their bloodline and their secrets through ecclesiastical networks. Local traditions in southern France consistently place Mary Magdalene in Marseille, accompanied by Lazarus, Martha, and others from Jesus' inner circle. These aren't medieval inventions, but appear in sources dating to the early centuries of Christianity. The legendary Holy Grail, brought by Mary Magdalene to France, takes on new meaning when interpreted as sang real royal blood. The precious cargo she carried wasn't a cup, but the genetic heritage of the Christ bloodline. Archaeological excavations around Rennes-le-Château have uncovered evidence of continuous occupation stretching back to Visigothic times. In 2003, a publicized excavation of Saunière's tower failed to unearth anticipated treasure, but simultaneous requests to excavate the church itself met with refusal from French archaeological authorities. The pattern of restriction extends beyond Rennes-le-Château. Across southern France, sites associated with Mary Magdalene legends face bureaucratic obstacles that prevent thorough investigation. Pierre Plantard, who claimed leadership of a secret society called the Priory of Sion, later admitted fabricating documents to support his claims. But his confession of fraud doesn't invalidate the historical traditions he exploited. It merely reveals how genuine mysteries can be manipulated for personal gain. The Cathars, who flourished in southern France until their extermination in the 13th century, taught doctrines that Orthodox Christianity found intolerable. Among these was the belief that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and had children. Montségur, the last Cathar fortress, fell in 1244 after a 10-month siege. Before surrendering, 4 Cathars escaped, carrying what chroniclers described as the treasure of the Cathars. This treasure was never found, leading to speculation that it contained not gold, but documents genealogies proving the survival of Christ's bloodline. The Merovingians claimed divine blood. But what if that wasn't metaphor? The Temple Mount in Jerusalem rises above the ancient city like a monument to mystery. For nearly 1,000 years, this sacred plateau has guarded secrets that multiple civilizations have killed to possess and died to protect. In 1119, 9 French knights appeared before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with an unusual request. Led by Hugues de Payens, they asked permission to establish quarters in the ruins of Solomon's Temple and to dedicate themselves to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. What happened next defies conventional explanation. For 9 years, these knights, who called themselves the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, recruited no new members, protected no pilgrims, and engaged in no documented military activities. Instead, they spent their time excavating beneath the Temple Mount. Captain Charles Wilson of the Royal Engineers discovered evidence of these excavations in 1867. Working with Lieutenant Warren and a team of British archaeologists, Wilson uncovered tunnels extending vertically from the Al-Aqsa Mosque down 25 meters before fanning out under the dome of the rock. Supposedly, Crusader artifacts were found in these tunnels, notes one archaeological report. The implications are staggering. The Knights Templar had spent nearly a decade conducting the most ambitious archaeological excavation in medieval history directly beneath the holiest site in Judaism and Islam. What were they searching for? Medieval chronicles speak of the treasures of Solomon's Temple, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden menorah, sacred scrolls containing the true history of ancient Israel. But modern research suggests they may have been seeking something far more precious: genealogical records, proving the survival of the Davidic bloodline. The transformation of the Templars from mysterious excavators to medieval Europe's most powerful military and financial organization occurred with suspicious speed. By 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the papal bull Omni Datum Optimum, granting the Templars unprecedented independence from local bishops and rulers. Their financial network stretched from London to Constantinople, creating Europe's first international banking system. Pilgrims could deposit money in one Templar preceptory and withdraw equivalent value thousands of miles away, secured by an encrypted system that prefigured modern financial instruments. But their true power lay not in their military prowess or financial innovation, but in their knowledge. Vatican archives confirm that the order possessed the Shroud of Turin for decades before its first public display. What other relics did they secretly guard? The connection to Rennes-le-Château runs deeper than conspiracy theorists imagine. Bertrand de Blanchefort, 6th Grand Master of the Knights Templar, owned lands in the region, though genealogical research reveals he was not related to the local Blanchefort family, as some authors have claimed. More significant is the documented presence of Templars at Bézieux, within sight of Rennes-le-Château. Local legends speak of Templar treasure hidden in the caves that honeycomb the limestone cliffs, but archaeological investigation remains restricted. The Knights Templars' destruction began at dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307. King Philip the Vulpert of France, heavily indebted to the order, coordinated simultaneous raids on every Templar preceptory in his realm. The knights were arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to heresies ranging from idol worship to homosexuality. But the Templar fortress at Blanchefort near Rennes-le-Château held out longer than others. This delay created sufficient time for the most precious Templar possessions to be hidden in the surrounding countryside. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, maintained his innocence even as flames consumed him on the stake in 1314. His dying words allegedly included a curse on the French royal line and a promise that the truth would eventually emerge. The survival of Templar knowledge through secret networks becomes more plausible when we examine their documented connections to the Cathars. Both groups flourished in southern France, both challenged Orthodox Christianity, and both were systematically exterminated by the Church. Recent analysis of Templar art and architecture reveals consistent symbolic patterns that suggest access to sources beyond the Bible. The famous head of Baphomet, which Templars allegedly worshipped, may represent not a demon but a coded reference to Sophia, the divine feminine wisdom, that Gnostic Christianity associated with Mary Magdalene. The order's emphasis on the Temple of Solomon takes on new significance when we consider that this was not just any temple, but the repository of Israel's genealogical records. The Templars' 9-year excavation may have uncovered documentation of Jesus' Davidic ancestry and its continuation through his descendants. Modern Freemasonry claims direct descent from the Knights Templar, preserving their symbols, rituals, and architectural knowledge. Masonic tradition speaks of a lost word that will be recovered when the temple is rebuilt, a reference that may encode the ultimate Templar secret. The Templars knew something worth dying for, something worth killing for. Margaret Starbird sits in her study surrounded by genealogical charts that trace royal lineages across centuries of European history. As a former Catholic nun turned independent researcher, she represents a growing community of scholars who believe the Jesus-Mary Magdalene bloodline survived and can be documented through careful genealogical analysis. Jesus was a lineal descendant of a royal bloodline that spanned 42 generations and included King Solomon and King David. She explains, pointing to family trees that stretch across her wall. Mary Magdalene was a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Their union would have created one of the most significant royal marriages in history. The mathematical precision appeals to believers who seek scientific validation for their theories. Astronomer John Pratt has calculated that exactly 10 Mercury cycles separate the proposed birth dates of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, both falling on the day designated as Worn Lord in ancient Hebrew calendar systems. The completion of cycles between the birth of Jesus and the proposed death date of Mary Magdalene is strong evidence, Pratt argues. The sacred calendars were testifying of this very point. Contemporary genealogists trace potential bloodline descendants through European royal houses with the thoroughness of professional historians. They point to consistent patterns, mysterious wealth, strategic marriages, and unusual protection by church authorities. The Merovingian dynasty, according to these researchers, represents only the most visible branch of a family tree that continued through the Carolingians and ultimately into modern European nobility. King Louis XV of France supposedly regarded himself as a descendant of Mary Magdalene, as did various members of the Habsburg dynasty. DNA analysis could resolve these questions definitively, but church authorities consistently refuse permission for testing of alleged relics. The skull of Mary Magdalene in France remains off-limits to genetic analysis, despite repeated requests from legitimate researchers. Scientists in general, and speaking only about the ones that are university faculty or employed by a certified DNA analysis laboratory, may only accept requests that have been duly authorized by the appropriate church legal bodies and representatives, explains one frustrated geneticist. The restrictions extend beyond religious relics. Families claiming descent from the Jesus bloodline report difficulty obtaining research grants, accessing archives, and publishing their findings in peer-reviewed journals. Modern Rex Deus families claiming descent from the 24 high priests of the temple in Jerusalem maintain they preserve genealogical records stretching back to biblical times. Their evidence, they claim, was deliberately scattered and hidden to prevent its destruction by hostile authorities. The emotional investment in divine ancestry creates its own evidence. Families pass down traditions of special blessing, unusual longevity, and spiritual gifts that they interpret as confirmation of their sacred heritage. But critics argue that bloodline claimants suffer from a fundamental misunderstanding of both genetics and genealogy. If Jesus and Mary Magdalene had children, and if their descendants survived and reproduced normally, then millions of people today would carry their genetic heritage, not the select few who claim royal privilege. The search for the bloodline has spawned a cottage industry of genealogical research, DNA testing services, and historical tours that capitalize on public fascination with alternative histories. Companies promise to trace customers' lineages back to biblical figures for fees ranging from hundreds to thousands of dollars. Yet genuine researchers continue their work despite financial and professional obstacles. They point to unexplained gaps in official genealogies, mysterious adoptions in royal families, and persistent legends that suggest hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. The Order of the Solar Temple, the Priory of Sion, and other modern secret societies claim to preserve Templar traditions and bloodline knowledge. Most prove to be elaborate hoaxes or commercial enterprises, but their existence suggests the enduring appeal of these ideas. Some researchers focus not on proving bloodline descent, but on understanding why these beliefs persist across cultures and centuries. They argue that the search for divine ancestry reflects fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and transcendence that Orthodox religion hasn't fully satisfied. If the bloodline survived, the implications would shatter more than just Christianity. They would rewrite the entire power structure of Western civilization. Dr. Philippe Charlier adjusts his laboratory equipment as he prepares to examine another ancient relic. As a biological anthropologist from the University of Versailles, he has spent his career applying cutting-edge scientific techniques to historical mysteries. But when it comes to the most sensitive religious artifacts, he encounters obstacles that have nothing to do with science. We are absolutely not sure that this is the true skull of Mary Magdalene, he admits, discussing his facial reconstruction work. But it was very important to get it out of anonymity. What he doesn't say is equally revealing. His hopes to conduct DNA tests on the remains have been repeatedly denied by church authorities. The technology exists to answer fundamental questions about biblical history. Modern DNA analysis can determine geographic origin, establish family relationships across centuries, and even identify specific individuals from degraded genetic material. Yet when researchers request permission to test artifacts that could resolve the greatest mysteries of Christianity, they encounter a wall of bureaucratic resistance. The Vatican maintains one of the world's largest collections of ancient documents and artifacts, including items that could definitively prove or disprove claims about Jesus' family relationships. Access to these materials remains strictly controlled with approval processes that can take years and often result in rejection without explanation. Dr. Leslie Northup, who has spent decades attempting to gain access to Vatican archives for legitimate historical research, describes the frustration. They have materials that could answer questions scholars have debated for centuries. When you ask why access is restricted, you're told it's for preservation reasons. But the same documents that are too fragile for academic study somehow survive public display during religious ceremonies. The Shroud of Turin represents both the promise and the limitations of scientific investigation into Christian relics. Carbon dating in 1988 suggested the shroud was medieval, but subsequent analysis of the tested samples revealed they came from patches added during medieval repairs, not the original fabric. Dr. Raymond Rogers, a chemist who examined additional samples, concluded that the original cloth could indeed date to the 1st century. His request to conduct more comprehensive testing met with Vatican refusal despite his impeccable scientific credentials. Similar restrictions apply to other significant relics. The alleged bones of St. Peter beneath the Vatican, the crown of thorns in Notre Dame Cathedral, and dozens of artifacts claimed to have direct connections to Jesus and his disciples remain off-limits to independent scientific analysis. The pattern extends beyond Rome. Orthodox churches, Protestant institutions, and Islamic authorities maintain similar restrictions on testing artifacts that could illuminate the historical foundations of their faiths. The justifications vary. Preservation concerns religious sensitivities, respect for tradition, but the result is the same science is kept away from the evidence. Archaeological permits face similar obstacles. The 2003 excavation attempt at Rennes-le-Château failed to obtain permission to investigate the church itself, despite its potential historical significance. Requests to excavate sites associated with Mary Magdalene in southern France routinely meet with refusal from French archaeological authorities. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed extensive underground chambers beneath many medieval churches, but permission to investigate these spaces is rarely granted. When investigations do occur, the results are often classified or restricted to religious authorities. Dr. Simcha Jacobovici, whose documentary investigations have challenged orthodox interpretations of biblical history, describes the systematic resistance. There's a deliberate effort to prevent scientific investigation of anything that might challenge established religious narratives. It's not about protecting artifacts. It's about protecting beliefs. The emergence of independent DNA testing companies has created new possibilities for bloodline research, but also new forms of restriction. Companies that once advertised ancestry tracing to biblical figures have quietly stopped offering such services after pressure from religious organizations. Modern families claiming descent from Jesus report difficulty obtaining genetic testing that could validate their claims. Laboratories cite concerns about the commercialization of religious heritage, but researchers suspect the real reason is institutional pressure to avoid controversial results. The Catholic Church's response to scientific challenges has evolved significantly since the Galileo affair, but core tensions remain. Pope Francis has acknowledged that science and faith should complement rather than contradict each other. Yet practical cooperation remains limited when fundamental doctrines are at stake. Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, head of the Pontifical Council for Culture, explains the Church's position. We welcome scientific investigation that enhances our understanding of history and faith, but we must also recognize that some questions cannot be answered through purely material analysis. Yet critics argue that this selective openness allows the Church to claim scientific support when convenient, while avoiding investigations that might prove inconvenient. The pattern suggests institutional fear of discoveries that could destabilize carefully constructed theological positions. Recent advances in archaeogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, have revolutionized our understanding of human migration, population, genetics, and family relationships in the ancient world. The same techniques that traced human evolution out of Africa could easily determine whether claimed relics contain genetic material from the Middle East during the 1st century. The fact that such analysis hasn't been conducted despite decades of technological capability suggests deliberate avoidance rather than practical impossibility. When the stakes are high enough, institutions find ways to prevent inconvenient truths from emerging. Dr. Spencer Wells, who directs the National Geographic Genographic Project, summarizes the situation. We have the scientific tools to answer these questions definitively. The only thing preventing answers is institutional resistance from organizations, that prefer uncertainty to potentially uncomfortable facts. The technology exists to answer these questions once and for all. So why won't they let us use it? Professor Bart Ehrman sits in his office at the University of North Carolina, surrounded by ancient texts that have occupied his scholarly career for over 3 decades. As one of the world's leading experts on early Christianity, he has spent years examining the evidence for Jesus' historical existence, his relationships, and the development of the church that formed around his memory. The historical evidence for Jesus of Nazareth is actually quite strong. He begins dispelling one conspiracy theory while acknowledging the complexity of others. Multiple independent sources confirm his existence, his role as a Jewish teacher and healer, and his execution by Roman authorities around 30 CE. But when the conversation turns to Jesus' personal relationships, Ehrman's certainty diminishes. The canonical Gospels give us very little information about Jesus' private life. They were written decades after his death by people who weren't eyewitnesses, and they were focused on his religious significance rather than biographical details. The Nag Hammadi texts add complexity rather than clarity to our understanding. While they provide evidence that some early Christians believed Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a special relationship, they also reflect theological developments that occurred decades or centuries after the historical events they purport to describe. Dr. Karen King's analysis of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife fragment exemplifies both the promise and the problems of this evidence. The papyrus was genuine 4th century material, but scholars remain divided on whether the text represents authentic early tradition or later theological speculation. What we can say with confidence is that there were multiple forms of early Christianity, some of which understood Jesus' relationships differently than what became Orthodox teaching. King explains. Whether these alternative understandings preserve historical memories or represent later theological developments is much harder to determine. The archaeological evidence from sites like Rennes-le-Château tells a similar story of complexity. Béranger Saunière's mysterious wealth has been convincingly explained through documented evidence of trafficking in masses, yet this prosaic explanation hasn't eliminated the legends that surround the site. The pattern appears throughout the historical record. Genuine mysteries become seeds for elaborate mythologies that often obscure rather than illuminate the original questions. Genealogical claims face mathematical realities that conspiracy theorists often ignore. If Jesus and Mary Magdalene had children who survived to reproduce, the number of their descendants today would be enormous rather than limited to a select few royal families. Dr. Mark Thomas, a geneticist at University College London, explains the mathematics. Any person living in Europe in the 1st century who had children whose lineages survived would have millions of descendants today. The idea that Jesus' bloodline could be preserved in a single royal family line is genetically impossible. Yet this mathematical reality doesn't invalidate all aspects of bloodline research. European royal families did preserve extensive genealogical records, and these documents sometimes reveal connections and patterns that merit historical investigation. The Knights Templar excavations beneath the Temple Mount appear to be historical fact, supported by archaeological evidence and documented in contemporary sources. What they discovered, if anything, remains unknown, but their 9-year presence beneath Judaism's holiest site suggests they were searching for something specific. The systematic suppression of alternative Christian texts is also well documented. The burning of libraries, the destruction of heretical writings, and the persecution of non-Orthodox Christian communities eliminated countless sources that might have preserved different perspectives on early Christian history. This historical context makes it impossible to argue from silence. The absence of evidence for Jesus' marriage doesn't prove he wasn't married. It could equally reflect the systematic destruction of records that didn't support Orthodox teaching. Modern DNA restrictions, while often justified on legitimate grounds, create additional uncertainty. When institutions possess the technical capability to answer fundamental historical questions, but choose not to exercise it, they inevitably fuel speculation about what such tests might reveal. The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail phenomenon demonstrates how genuine historical puzzles can spawn elaborate conspiracy theories that combine fact speculation and outright fiction into narratives that many people find more compelling than academic uncertainty. Pierre Plantard's admission that he fabricated key documents exposing the Priory of Sion as a modern hoax. Yet this revelation hasn't eliminated belief in bloodline theories, it has simply redirected attention to other sources of evidence. The psychological appeal of these narratives runs deeper than mere historical curiosity. In an age of institutional decline and spiritual uncertainty, the idea of a hidden sacred bloodline offers both meaning and hope that transcends conventional religious boundaries. Dr. Elaine Pagels, whose work on Gnostic Christianity has influenced decades of scholarship, reflects on the broader implications. These alternative gospels and bloodline theories speak to something many people find missing in conventional Christianity. The idea that the divine is not distant and transcendent, but intimate and accessible through direct experience. The scientific method demands skepticism, but it also requires openness to evidence that challenges established assumptions. The fact that DNA testing of key artifacts remains restricted means that crucial questions remain unanswered rather than definitively resolved. But perhaps the real treasure isn't what we've found, it's what the search has revealed about ourselves. The sunrise over Rennes-le-Château paints the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber, the same light that has illuminated these mysteries for over a century. Pilgrims continue to arrive daily, drawn by questions that academic explanations haven't fully satisfied, and legends that scholarly debunking hasn't entirely killed. Dr. Hugh Schonfield, author of The Passover Plot, spent his final years reflecting on the enduring appeal of alternative Christian narratives. People aren't just seeking historical facts, he observed. They're seeking meaning, connection, and a sense that there's more to existence than what institutions tell them. The quest for the Holy Grail, whether understood as cup bloodline or spiritual metaphor, continues to evolve with each generation. Medieval knights sought a physical chalice that would grant spiritual salvation. Renaissance alchemists searched for the philosopher's stone that would perfect both matter and spirit. Modern researchers pursue DNA evidence that might rewrite religious history. Each age projects its own needs and assumptions onto the Grail legend, finding in its ambiguity a mirror for their deepest aspirations. The cup that Christ drank from becomes whatever the seeker most desperately needs it to be. Dr. Margaret Starbird, whose research spans decades of bloodline investigation, has watched the evolution of these ideas with growing sophistication. We've moved beyond simple treasure hunting or conspiracy theories, she explains. The real quest is for understanding of history of spirituality, of our place in a larger cosmic story. New archaeological techniques continue to reveal surprises that challenge established narratives. Ground-penetrating radar has located previously unknown chambers beneath ancient churches. Advanced dating methods have revealed that some dismissed medieval forgeries actually contain much older materials. Digital analysis of manuscript illuminations has uncovered hidden symbols and connections that previous generations missed. The recent discovery at Petra of a vessel resembling the Holy Grail, while ultimately identified as a 1st century BC jug fragment, demonstrates how archaeology continues to find echoes of legend in historical reality. Each discovery raises new questions even as it answers old ones. Modern genetics has revolutionized our understanding of human migration and population history. The techniques that traced humanity's exodus from Africa and mapped the peopling of the globe could easily determine the geographic origins and family relationships of alleged biblical relics if institutional gatekeepers permitted such testing. The restriction of scientific access to religious artifacts creates a curious parallel to the medieval suppression of alternative gospels. In both cases, authorities limit access to evidence that might challenge established narratives, ensuring that crucial questions remain unresolved rather than definitively answered. Yet the digital age has democratized access to information in ways that make traditional gatekeeping increasingly difficult. Ancient texts are being digitized and made available online. Independent researchers can collaborate across continents. Crowdsourced analysis projects engage thousands of volunteer investigators in solving historical puzzles. The Internet has also facilitated the spread of both genuine scholarship and elaborate conspiracy theories, creating an information environment where distinguishing between evidence and speculation requires more critical thinking skills than many people possess. Dr. James Tabor, whose archaeological work in Israel has uncovered new evidence about early Christianity, sees both promise and peril in these developments. We have access to more information than any previous generation, but we also face more sophisticated forms of misinformation. The challenge is learning to evaluate sources and distinguish between what we can know and what we can only speculate about. The institutional response to alternative historical narratives has evolved from suppression to engagement. The Catholic Church now acknowledges the complexity of early Christian history while maintaining its core theological positions. Academic biblical studies has become more open to diverse perspectives while maintaining scholarly standards. Yet fundamental tensions remain. Religious institutions depend on certain historical narratives for their authority and identity. Academic disciplines have their own orthodoxies and career incentives that can discourage inconvenient research. Popular culture often prioritizes entertainment value over historical accuracy. The search for the historical Jesus and his relationships continues through careful analysis of ancient sources, archaeological investigation, and comparative religious studies. Each generation of scholars brings new methods and perspectives to old questions, gradually building a more complete picture of first-century Christianity. The bloodline theories, while largely unsupported by credible evidence, have served the useful purpose of highlighting gaps in our historical knowledge and assumptions in traditional narratives. They have forced scholars to examine their methods and biases more carefully. Modern pilgrims to sites like Rennes-le-Château often report that their interest in conspiracy theories evolves into deeper appreciation for genuine historical complexity. The journey from sensational speculation to serious inquiry parallels humanity's broader evolution, from mythological to scientific thinking. The Holy Grail remains as elusive as ever, but the search has revealed treasures that the original seekers never imagined: new understanding of early Christianity, appreciation for the diversity of human spiritual experience, and recognition that the most important mysteries might be those that unite rather than divide us. Contemporary scholars like Professor John Dominic Crossan emphasize that the historical quest for Jesus should enhance rather than diminish faith. The more we understand about the historical context of Christianity's origins, the more remarkable the movement's achievements become. You don't need supernatural explanations to recognize that something extraordinary happened in first-century Palestine. The future of Grail research lies not in proving or disproving specific theories, but in developing better methods for distinguishing between historical possibility and historical probability. DNA analysis of ancient remains, when conducted with appropriate safeguards and transparency, could resolve some questions while undoubtedly raising others. Digital humanities projects are creating new possibilities for analyzing vast amounts of historical data to identify patterns and connections that individual researchers might miss. Artificial intelligence may eventually assist in deciphering damaged texts and identifying authentic materials. But technology alone cannot answer the deeper questions that drive the eternal quest. The search for meaning, purpose, and connection that motivates modern Grail seekers requires not just scientific investigation, but also philosophical reflection and spiritual discernment. The bloodline believers, the academic skeptics, and the religious authorities all represent different approaches to fundamental human questions about origin, meaning, and destiny. Their disagreements often reflect different assumptions about the relationship between history and truth, between fact and significance. Perhaps the greatest treasure hidden in the Grail legends is the recognition that truth comes in multiple forms. Historical truth tells us what happened. Scientific truth explains how things work. Spiritual truth reveals what matters. The quest for the Holy Grail engages all three forms of truth simultaneously. The mystery endures not because evidence is lacking, but because the questions it raises transcend what any single piece of evidence could resolve. Whether Jesus was married, whether his bloodline survived, whether the Grail was cup or womb or metaphor, these questions matter not just for what they tell us about the past, but for what they reveal about our deepest hopes and fears for the future. We have traveled from the limestone caves of Nag Hammadi to the misty peaks of the Pyrenees, from ancient Jerusalem to modern laboratories. We have examined papyrus and DNA legends and lies, faith and facts. We have encountered believers and skeptics, scholars and conspiracists, saints and charlatans. The evidence we have presented doesn't prove that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, that their children founded royal dynasties, or that the Holy Grail contains sacred blood rather than sacred wine. But it doesn't disprove these possibilities either. And perhaps that's the point. History isn't about certainty, it's about continuing to ask the right questions. Science isn't about final answers, it's about better methods for distinguishing between what we can know and what we can only wonder about. Faith isn't about blind belief, it's about finding meaning and purpose in the face of irreducible mystery. The restriction of DNA testing of religious artifacts means that crucial questions remain unanswered. Why do church authorities refuse scientific analysis that could confirm the authenticity of their most precious relics? What other texts might still be hidden in monastery libraries and Vatican vaults? How many bloodlines claim descent from biblical figures, and what would comprehensive genetic testing reveal? These aren't conspiracy theories. They're legitimate questions that our technology could answer if institutional gatekeepers permitted investigation. The fact that such permission is consistently denied suggests that those in authority believe the risks of discovery outweigh the benefits of certainty. But truth has a way of emerging despite institutional resistance. Every archaeological excavation, every manuscript discovery, every scientific advancement brings us closer to understanding our past. The digital age has democratized access to information and analysis tools that previous generations of researchers could barely imagine. The Holy Grail may be the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, the womb that carried his children, or simply the eternal human quest for connection with the divine. The bloodline may consist of genetic descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, or it may represent the spiritual inheritance that belongs to all who seek truth with courage and humility. What we can say with confidence is that the search itself has revealed more about human nature than any treasure ever could. It has shown us how desperate we are for meaning in an apparently meaningless universe, how willing we are to believe in hidden connections between past and present, how much we need stories that make our lives feel significant. The conspiracy theories and alternative histories that surround the Grail legend often reveal more about contemporary anxieties than ancient truths. In an age of institutional decline and spiritual uncertainty, people seek alternative sources of authority and meaning. The idea of a sacred bloodline offers both continuity with the past and hope for the future, but the genuine historical questions that drive scholarly research remain as compelling as ever. Early Christianity was far more diverse than traditional accounts suggest. Women played more significant roles than Orthodox interpretation acknowledges. The relationship between historical fact and theological interpretation is more complex than either fundamentalists or skeptics typically recognize. The future belongs to those who can navigate this complexity without losing their sense of wonder. The next generation of researchers will have access to scientific tools that today's investigators can barely imagine. They will analyze DNA from samples too degraded for current technology, decode texts too damaged for present methods, and discover connections too subtle for existing analytical techniques. They will also face the same fundamental choices that have confronted every generation of truth seekers, whether to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it challenges cherished assumptions, whether to ask uncomfortable questions, even when authorities discourage inquiry, whether to remain open to mystery even when certainty would be more comfortable. The truth is out there, but it's not hidden in any conspiracy. It's waiting in archives yet to be opened, in artifacts yet to be tested, in connections yet to be made. It's embedded in the patient work of scholars who refuse to stop searching, in the courage of investigators who challenge established narratives, and in the wisdom of seekers who understand that the most important discoveries often come from asking better questions rather than defending predetermined answers. If you found yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about history, you're not alone. If you've wondered why certain artifacts remain off-limits to scientific analysis, you're asking the right questions. If you've sensed that there's more to these ancient stories than official accounts acknowledge, you're participating in humanity's oldest and most important quest. The Holy Grail represents whatever is most precious to those who seek it. For medieval knights, it was salvation through spiritual adventure. For Renaissance alchemists, it was perfection through hidden knowledge. For modern researchers, it might be understanding through scientific investigation. But for all seekers across all ages, the Grail has represented the possibility that reality is larger and more meaningful than it appears on the surface. It embodies the hope that truth exists, that it can be found, and that the search itself transforms those who undertake it with sufficient dedication and humility. The bloodline of Christ may flow through the veins of European nobility, or it may flow through the hearts of all who seek to embody love, justice, and truth in their daily lives. The sacred cup may rest in a cathedral treasury, or it may exist wherever human beings share bread and wine in memory of sacrifice and hope. The search continues, because the questions matter more than the answers. In seeking the Grail, we discover not just what we're looking for, but who we become in the process of looking. In investigating the bloodline, we uncover not just genetic connections to the past, but spiritual connections to each other. The truth is out there, but it's up to you to find it. The quest for the Holy Grail will continue as long as human beings wonder about their origins, question their authorities, and hope for meaning that transcends the apparent randomness of existence. Whether you find cup or bloodline history or legend, the real treasure will be what the search reveals about the infinite depth of human curiosity and the eternal power of hope. The mystery endures, and so does the quest. The next chapter of this ancient story is waiting to be written by those brave enough to ask the questions that matter most, skilled enough to distinguish between evidence and speculation, and wise enough to recognize truth in whatever form it takes. The Holy Grail awaits, but perhaps not where you expect to find it.